Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of SPME and ASMIA, and it is my pleasure to once again welcome you all to our webinar series. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to talk to our friend John Spencer. John is the Chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. He is the expert on urban warfare, and nobody knows more about the topic than John does. This afternoon, we're going to discuss all the ins and outs of the Gaza war, how we got here, where we're going, and take it from there. As always, this format this afternoon is going to be more about our conversation, which we will share with you, the audience, at a very at very closely as far as the date goes. At a close date, and we will take it from there. So, John, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Asaf. It's great to be with you.
Great. So let me start off by asking the first question, and then we'll take it from there. Um, You've been studying, a lot about Gaza, and you've been to Gaza for, several times at this point, checking out the environment and looking at where things are at. There's a lot of discussion about how we got here, and you've been very clear in your writing about distinguishing between, the defining the operations, making clear what exactly the objectives are, and also distinguishing between who the players are in this regard. I would argue that the war began, or part of the challenges as you look back until we got to 10/7, that Israel's been fighting what they call the war between wars, and the Hamas. What you clearly define, and you said it a lot in your writings, invaded in a clear invasion on October 7th. Israel focused a great deal on looking at the surgical attacks, but not treating Hamas as the power that it should be treated as it relates to the military power and the political power. So why don't you give us like a kind of a scorecard, or for lack of a better term, how the failures that that got us to 10/7, and kind of like walk us through since 10/7, what Israel did right, and what Israel, as far as where Israel is going, and what are the challenges? Obviously, there are a lot of questions, and we can dive into that as far as what the day after tomorrow looks like. But understanding these very parameters that you describe very clearly in a lot of the work that you've done and a lot of your observations and conversations.
Sure, that's a big goal. I'll give it a shot. As I'm a war researcher at heart. That's what I do. I research war. I've been doing it for a long time. I do it all around the world. And I think really the context is the question, right? We say in like military historians, you study war in width, depth, and context. For some reason, the context seems to escape everybody. Most people haven't been on the ground to even know the distance and proximity that Gaza is to southern Israel, to those villages and kibbutzim and cities that Hamas attacked on October 7th. So you wanted to know what kind of the pre-October 7th, and I was on the ground after, really during and after Operation Guardians of the Wall in 2021, the last time that Hamas broke a so-called ceasefire, and then that operation. And the threat that was perceived to be Hamas is threat in the hierarchy of threats. And I've since October 7th now been to Israel 5 times, been into Gaza 4 times with the IDF embedded to observe their operations in what I call the greatest military challenge, urban-centric military challenge of modern history, let alone if history, depending on the context that you use. But I've also interviewed the political leadership, from the prime minister to the defense minister to the head of the IDF, because all war is the pursuit of political goals, and the military executes like you said, the military objectives that they're given. If you want to talk pre-October 7th, of course, Hamas was relegated to a lesser threat of the hierarchy of threats that Israel has faced from Iran, Hezbollah, to Hamas, to terrorism in Judea and Samaria. And since October 7th, most people won't acknowledge that if we talk about Israel's operations in Gaza, you cannot disassociate that with the Seven Front War, fighting Hezbollah in the north, Iran attacking in April and October of 2024, and then now, of course, after the 12-day war, is that if you were just to take a military problem set up against Hamas, that would be different than if you're fighting other wars at the same time, because it really does come down to what we say in ways and means. You have an end you want to get to, but do you have the right ways, and do you have the means to do those, to achieve those ways, depending on what we're talking about. Hamas had built, of course, the probably the most militarized terrain that any military has ever faced in modern history as well. Since the disengagement, not deoccupation, disengagement, Hamas has been building Gaza for the sole purpose of war, for what they say is the sole purpose of destroying Israel. So that includes a vast array of defensive terrain. So, of course, most people know about the 300 to 400 miles or, 400 to 500 kilometers of tunnels, very unique in the history of war to have that amount of tunnels, so bigger than the New York Metro, the London Metro, the Seoul Metro, a huge underground world for the sole purpose of military technology. I mean, offensive, defensive, military tech capability. No civilians allowed in Hamas tunnels. They're not protective. Billions of dollars of investment underneath every inch of ground. And I've been into places like the Netrin Corridor, into Khan Yunis, where every step you take, it's more likely than not that there's a tunnel underneath you. That's a really different environment just from a military lens. On top of the strategy that Hamas uses, which is people won't acknowledge is very unique, where the use of human shields, which was, Hamas put their military infrastructure underneath civilian infrastructure or protected sites like hospitals, schools, mosques, government buildings, things like that. But it also put it underneath all the civilian homes and buildings and everything. That's unique. I mean, even if you look at underground warfare of like Vietnam and the tunnels of Cu Chi and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they weren't built underneath civilians for the purpose of using the civilians as their shield. But Hamas also uses a human sacrifice, their words, not mine, to where they want to get as many of their population killed as possible to achieve the political goal, which is to invoke the international community to force Israel to stop and allow them to win, in my terms, the war. That's all was built in Gaza before October 7th, this massive defensible terrain. And in the history of warfare, especially urban warfare, the defender has a unique advantage. And in most cases, if we go back to Stalingrad forward, the defender has had a limited amount of time to prepare the defense. And that really matters on what the battle will look like, is how much time has the defender and what other tactics and techniques they're using had to defend. So on October 8th, when Israel was formulating, although they already had plans, and that's been a real point of contention, plans for the destruction of Hamas in Gaza, they were facing this 20-year defensive environment that was built for the sole purpose of war, let alone the 20,000 rockets that Hamas had amassed, which, prior to October 7th was viewed as the main threat, right? The launching of these short-range missiles as opposed to Hezbollah, which are medium range. If not, they had tried to develop some long-range capability. That was viewed as the biggest threat Hamas was. So there was a lot of, and I'm sure this is part of your question, in complacency in Hamas wasn't a threat. It was contained. The wall is an early detection, the iron wall. You had certain forces like the Gaza division who were supposed to respond to an incursion if there was one. But even the plan that was the Jericho plan that was, that some people had a year plus in advance was viewed as aspirational as to what Hamas could actually do. All of that factored in, of course. But the intelligence failure, the failure of imagination that was prior to October 7th, for me, is separate than, okay, here's the context. Let's lay the context out in all truthfulness to the techniques that Hamas uses in the human shields, human sacrifice, the radicalized population. Hamas was believed to be around 30 to 40,000 fighters, right? A military. It was a military with brigades, with geographic locations, with battalions and companies ready to fight, defend, and attack in that zone. But that's not the only people who were joined in the war, as we call it, joined in the hostilities. Because you have many other terrorist organizations in Gaza that the IDF were going to face when they entered to seize and hold and take terrain from Gaza. As the war progressed, though, so on October 8th, this is the challenge. You have a 30,000, 40,000 Hamas military arrayed in 24 separate battalions across the Gaza Strip, mainly in northern Gaza, where the heart of the Hamas military was. But you had all these subordinate forces like Lions Den, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, just regular people who want to join the fight that the IDF would face, with the goal, of course, the hostages, which is not unique in war, but very unique in a military context to have hostages as your highest goal to retrieve the hostages as well. There's a couple other instances of hostages in war, but not this scale of the complexity of the terrain. As October 8th happens, you formulate the plan. Israel mobilizes 300,000 forces. It's also faced with this awful decision of Hezbollah is arrayed to do an October 7th incursion and volley of fire since Hamas launched 4,000 rockets on October 7th alone and never stopped and still launched around 13,000 rockets. Israel's small military, even if it mobilized, was split in a decision on whether to head north and defend from a massacre in the north to start operations in Gaza while also being attacked on other fronts. In order to destroy Hamas's military, you had to enter that ground, start an air campaign. And this is the complexity that everybody has lost in fast forwarding to just looking at what's been achieved or not, the effects of the combat versus false comparisons, and what the IDF could do, should have done, given the limited means it had, having to split its forces, having a not having a standing army, really having this mobilized reserve from the nation to fight occupation style. Basically, you had to go in, you had to take the ground, you had to hold it. Part of the war, but also the international pressure that was involved. You can't separate that from the war. There is what we call war on paper, and then there's war in reality. War in reality is always these international, geopolitical, even local political implications of what can be done in the combat zone, what resources, and even threats from external pressures or actual repercussions, like we've seen since October 7th, when the United States at times said, we will not send you more weapons, we will not defend you if you're attacked, based on the operations going on in Gaza and the misinformation, which is the eighth front of the war that I've been fighting since October 7th. It's just, thousands of what we call misinformation. So it's a kernel of truth spun into a lie and then spread around the world as misinformation, from casualties to access to food to intent of the operation, all of these elements. That level of misinformation was a enemy that no military is prepared for. Israel's sparked was unique because of the scale of this war, but also the social media driven algorithm that feeds the entire world, every cell phone in the world getting fed the horrors of war and then translating themselves, unlike we've ever seen in war. There's always been this element of influencing of populations through, TV, news, and all these things, but this is a new type of warfare where the entire world can be fed information in many cases in this from straight a terrorist organization, and then it is believed, and then fire fuel is spread, and for some reason it goes viral in many cases, even if it's a flat out lie. These are the context of Israel's operations in Gaza that seem to escape everybody when they approach it from a very narrow context, whether it's Israel's decisions, whether it's the reality of what's happening on the ground, what does the law of war say should happen, how does proportionality work? There's so many angles that I've been researching, not just from what's actually happening. And this is where some people believe you don't have to be on the ground to know what's happening, and I disagree. If you want to know what a military is trying to do or what happened at an event, it really helps to go there and collect first person research versus what is being translated through second, third, fourth person and then spread into a story.
Great, thank you. Alex, I know we have a lot of questions.
I have a lot of questions. Let me go back to um, urban warfare and the preparation of this unique battle space. And the you mentioned the failure of imagination and the intelligence failure. And this is there's been a lot of work that's been done on this. But one of the most interesting things to me is this idea that a an entire underground battle space can be prepared, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of tunnels and spaces, um, and for this not to be incorporated mentally, strategically, creatively into strategic assessment. On the one hand, we have seen rapid adaptation. Israeli military did have particular engineering units and intelligence units, and then new technological units. But if you dig hundreds of miles of tunnels, there are tailings that come out, and we see this in Iran, we see this in North Korea. We saw this in Lebanon also with Hezbollah's tunnels. Why why the failure for all of this evidence, empirical evidence, to penetrate the imagination of the strategic imagination?
Sure. So I think that data point is separate than the failure to anticipate an invasion of this scale. I do believe and in some ways know that Israel knew that Hamas was digging tunnels, lots of tunnels. The amount of cement going in and the lack of high rises going up. Uh, the economy basically it is its own economy of digging tunnels. But the threat to Israel's national security for many years was cross-border tunnels, right? So cross-border tunnels from not just Gaza, but Lebanon as well. So that was the national security threat. And Israel did successfully stop cross-border tunnels from Gaza with a deep buried fence with sensors that can detect even seismic activity of going underground. But I don't connect the intelligence failure of I view it as a sign of Israel's true disengagement from Gaza. I'm like, look, if they want to dig tunnels underneath every building, that's on them. What has that got to do with Israel? And this is a real sign of disengagement. Now, the intelligence failures were the piecing together the dots of the large scale, which is really, in my estimation, of division level attack and all the disassociated information from the Jericho plan to the intelligence observers to the signals intelligence to the night before. Those are some intelligence failures, but I do understand and want to be as objective as possible as, you know, Israel has a portfolios of threats to its survival, and it allocates resources against those. I mean, what we saw happen against Iran in Operation Rising Lion is decades and hundreds of man hour, unimaginable investment in intelligence collection, intelligence assets, capabilities development. In Gaza, there's a long kind of reasoning of why that was relegated to the lowest threat. And in Israel, even its society had gotten complacent. If you look at even the weapons policies in the envelope and the kibbutz security
Security
having
teams.
those weapons in their warehouses and every aspect of this. I don't associate the tunnel and what Hamas is doing to the actual intelligence failure and the lack of imagination in the actual incursion into Israel versus what was the old threat of the cross-border tunnels, grabbing hostages, exchanging hostages for exorbitant basically costs.
Do you have a sense of what the strategic assessment of all this tunnel building was for? This is just something that Hamas does as a part of the local economy, or are they really preparing a battle space and we just didn't really think it through?
No, I don't have that level of granularity, and especially basically I do all unclassified research.
Sure.
Um, it would be fair to say, reasonable to say that Israel definitely knew that Hamas was people within the Israel intelligence apparatus knew that Hamas was digging tunnels. Now you could question the presence of the tunnels between Gaza and Egypt, the that some people believe was one of the main armament venues, although I've researched conflicting information on whether how much were those tunnels being used, how many were active, as in the ability for Hamas to gain this level of arsenal. But we've also seen that Hamas, and these are the things that I think are more, for me, important than just knowing that somebody's digging a tunnel between houses, and there are variations of these tunnels. There are the tactical tunnels that go from house to house or building to building, the ones that connect different units in a neighborhood, and those that connect, brigades to each other across northern and southern, these mile long, 2 mile long tunnels. And like you said, I mean, Israel is the most prepared military in the world for underground warfare. But if you have this level of an environment being built, it was shown to be still a capabilities gap against the threat. Going back again, is it a threat to Israel that these tunnels were there? I could understand in the hierarchy of worst case scenarios, and even the US military does this, where you have basically what we call defense planning scenarios. What's the worst case scenario? This is where you get into the failure imagination. I mean, again, Gaza doesn't have basically agriculture. Gaza doesn't have many industries. It became reliant on basically humanitarian aid from United Nations and countries. The fact that it was doing this tunnel digging, I wouldn't even now, going back in reflection, view that as how are you missing this threat to Israel's national security, to its border security? Israel stopped the cross-border tunnels. Yes, we can go back and look at the individual from intelligence hierarchy, the fact that Hamas was relegated to the bottom, and it took advantage to the status it had been given down on the bottom, and to take advantage of the complacency, whether it's the size of the border security force, the reliance on technology that it was able to defeat, the you know all of these factors add up to what we call the black swan event, which is none of these things in and of themselves add up to a failure. It's a collection of all of them, but also strategic thinking. I mean, Hamas, from Yahya Sinwar to Hania, was trying to convince the world that they didn't want war, right? So they went on like a public relations campaign, and I remember this, where they were going to major United Nations and other functions saying, look, we don't want war. We just want, we need more help in aid and things like that, all the time planning for this massive war that Iran, now the intelligence is very clear, triggered, supported, facilitated to stop normalization of Israel and other countries in the Middle East.
Great. So a segue to that, John, and that's a good question, to your last point. So is Israel achieving its goals? I mean, there are obviously there are many philosophies or many kind of theories within the intelligence community and Israel at large, that Hamas is an idea, and how do you defeat an idea? And we're and to parenthetically to that, the question is also, of course, what is the alternative to Hamas? I mean, Israel is dealing, and I know you've looked at all of this, as far as Israel, has stated that they don't want to occupy Gaza. What's the alternative? And the fact that they are cutting off the heads of the snake with the leadership and whatnot, Hamas is still there politically speaking. And then what's the alternative of this? Is Israel, are the stated goals from the beginning of the war actually attainable and achievable? And as you correctly state, they've had many successes as far as where we are and how we got here over the past, almost 2 years at this point. But are they able to, like, prevent another 10-7, which they all talk about in the assessments as far as what next with all of this?
It's a great question. And it's a complicated, not complex, complicated question. I've been, like I said, I've interviewed the prime minister himself and asked him multiple times. And if you study war, you know that the goals of a war can actually change because it's always uncertain. Like if you point to like the Ukraine-Russia war, the goals for Russia changed for intermediate goals. For Israel after October 7th, the three goals have remained the same. I do believe they're measurable and achievable from as an analyst. The goal of returning all the hostages, destroying Hamas as a military and political apparatus or governing authority in Gaza, and then ensuring that no threat comes from Gaza ever again. How is that going? Or are you talking the larger perspective of if you look at the Ring of Fire, the security situation that was October 6th, these giants of threats from Hezbollah's missile arsenal and military to Iran's ballistic missile program, nuclear program, uh, even when the Syria connection between Iran, if you want me to look at that broader perspective, I do strongly believe that Israel has created a period of stability and peace that was unthinkable prior to October 6th. Now, in the three goals of strictly, since Israel did declare war, which is for me as a war analyst very different, right? We have these, like you said, people will try to take this way back, go back many, many years, and the underlying reasons for war. But I do believe wars have a start date and an end date. They have named operations. If you're talking about just Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza with those three stated goals, Israel has destroyed Hamas's military. It does not have a military at this moment. It has a very loosely configured guerrilla force willing to resist until they can get convinced that they don't have a path to victory. Israel has brought, you know, over almost 200 of the 250 hostages home. And there's talks right now of bringing more home in a temporary ceasefire. And it has fractured Hamas's governing authority where there's now competition within Gaza. And of course, the last one about, which is where some people try to go is, and I heard this early in the war, well, they can't do another October 7th. Well, that's not, I don't see that as a defined goal. The not ever going back to a situation that was October 6th, which is you see this growing threat. And because of the political kind of situation, you can't do anything about it. Even if you knew it, what is Israel, the preemptiveness of attacking into Gaza? Now, the one thing you talked about, which is you can't kill an ideal this way, and I've dealt with this since October 7th as well, because there's a lot of heuristics in the broader world about counterinsurgency theory, right? That's just what people know. It's what they've lived, from Vietnam to the 20 plus years of the global war on terrorism for the American military. And that was the wrong framework to think about Hamas because the goal was to destroy its military and remove it from power. It has nothing to do with the idea. The ideal of Hamas is in the post-conflict operation, much like if you look at any of the similar campaigns against Japan, against Germany, where the goal is very similar to defeat their military and remove them from power. That is a more like situation. In order to do that, you don't use counterinsurgency theory to get to the first goal, which is remove them from power, right? This is the ideal that you could uphold, the German population or the Japanese population and their support for the Third Reich or the Imperial Japan mattered to your progress to destroy their military and achieve that goal of defeating their will. When Israel started this war, though, as a point of criticism, and said, we will not occupy Gaza. I don't know of any other situations where you can remove a political power without temporarily occupying the ground that that power controls. And when Israel took that off the table in the beginning, and the strategies it used to clear, as in raid in and out, was very successful at destroying Hamas's coherent military capability, but very ineffective at removing its political power. Because if you just leave, then everybody knows Hamas are the guys who have the power, they have the guns, they will ruthlessly enforce, from policing to humanitarian aid deliveries. If you're not going to be there 24 hours a day controlling the environment, then you're not going to be that successful at reducing its powers. Now, there are other strategies which we've seen, since the end of the last ceasefire, like arming rival powers, right? You call them clans, gangs when I was in Baghdad, others. That's historical in war too. In this phase where you're trying to remove and destroy the other power, you arm oppositions to it. But this ideal that you can't destroy an ideal, right? So that gets into de-radicalization, which is if people would acknowledge the radicalization that was happening in Gaza for over 20 years, right? So the books in the schools, the summer camps in the summer, over 100,000 Gazan kids being radicalized and trained to kill Jewish people and Israelis specifically. There would have to be a de-radicalization in order to negate the idea of Hamas and fundamentalist Islamic ideals. But that has nothing to do with removing a power from an environment. Yes, you have to replace that power. When Israel said, well, we're not going to be that power, we're not going to occupy in any way, then there, for me as an analyst, there's not few historical examples where you could achieve that goal of removing a power without replacing it. So you either got to be it yourself, and not that the U.S. military has had any success in building nations, but we have had success in removing a power and then having another power there, whether you back it or you are temporarily it yourself. This is where Israel hasn't been able to communicate. How do you remove a power, but you're not the power? You haven't named a power, which is challenging in a radicalized environment like this. Who's going to volunteer, even if they don't believe in the ideals, to be the new power is really complex. And there is a whole field of study of that. And you still, once you get into that phase, you do have to start doing counterinsurgency theory of like population protection and separating the radicalized people who still think they can win and take their guns, which is a big part of demilitarization. All of this gets mixed up for people to think that you can't kill an ideal this way. Like, well, that's not what they're doing at this moment. They're trying to destroy a military and remove a political power as the governing authority.
Right. Alex?
The idea of counterinsurgency and a war moving from one phase to another is very interesting. And all of a sudden I had flashbacks to Vietnam, not of my own, but from my childhood, moving from the Westmoreland phase to the Creighton Abrams phase, from the winning hearts and minds to the village clearances and things like that. But in all this, just to use that one analogy, the Tet Offensive was very much a turning point, and I recall this quite well as a child, seeing it on TV and people declaring this as the moment when things were lost. and it was 4 more years, 5 more years of until there was a stopping place where everybody and completely innovative tactics being brought to bear in order to get to that stopping place where at least the major power could say, okay, this is we're going to declare victory here, along with negotiations about the shape of the which started with the shape of the table and all this kind of um, drawn out nonsense, which is very redolent of what we see today with Hamas and the intermediaries and so on. So it seems to me that control of the narratives is very much a characteristic of the modern age of warfare since World War II, since the willingness of the West to utterly and completely crush its opponents or have opponents crushed, and create um, unapologetically masses of civilian casualties um, as part of the logical, inevitable, acceptable price of warfare. But since whatever, pick the date, 1968, Tet Offensive, this has been unacceptable, and certainly for Israel, it's been unacceptable. So the question of unconditional surrender, but really the question of the day after. When you get to a stopping point and responsibility for the day after, and self-imposed, as you say, self-imposed kinds of limitations on no occupation or the Pottery Barn rule, um, uh, that tied tied American hands in Iraq and Afghanistan, however you want to put it. Um, is this where we're at? I mean, do you think my assessment is correct? I have a particular framework, but how can we escape from these self-imposed limitations, or are these just inevitable where the West is at?
It's a great question. And there's a lot of nuances in what you just discussed that I think a lot of people, unlike you, don't remember. I mean, history doesn't repeat itself, it sure does rhyme. One of the challenges in Vietnam was it's really hard, which is people, and I hate the term forever war or endless war, but it's really hard to fight a counterinsurgency for a government that people don't accept. And as you know, in South Vietnam, that was the big issue. It wasn't just an inability to destroy the Vietnamese or the Viet Cong. It was legitimacy of the host nation government and there being a foreseeable way to achieve that, corruption or acceptance in the community. There are that nuances, but you're right in having studied the Battle of Hue during the Tet Offensive, the Cronkite effect. If you've lost your populations, which is really what it was, Cronkite came back and said, based on my assessment, and we see this today as well, is like there's no way to achieve the goal you say you're pursuing, right? So for South Vietnam to be able to be self-sustainable and through this strategy, I think we have some of that again on what is the goal and how is it achievable and are we progressing? But there are other factors here, of course, is the ideal that this can be done quickly. So for some reason, much of the world believes that wars can end quickly, and depending on all the context of the war. If anybody in Israel thought that you could go into Gaza and remove Hamas from power, who has been radicalizing the population for 16 years, if that could be done quickly, it's just not factoring in the nuances of even historical examples of doing that with the resources you have. Even if you use counterinsurgency math, what we call, the 1 to 1,000 or whatever the population, how many forces you would have to deploy into an environment and leave them there to achieve that strategy that has worked in some cases and not worked in others. And there is also nuances on like what is Gaza? Is Gaza a nation? Are you know, like you said, in Iraq, we brought government with us. It did work to achieve a certain level of legitimacy, and as soon as we left, it went back to sectarianism that caused the rise of ISIS and things like that. There are some you mentioned the kind of policies, right? So self-restriction or other restrictions. And if we haven't mentioned so far, one of the complexities of Gaza that I don't find anywhere else in the history, and I actually just had General McMaster, one of our greatest military minds and historians, also not know of a case where there is a very dense area. And the step one of a military, even in Vietnam, this was the case, was to move civilians out of harm's way. And in Gaza, having Egypt impose a restriction and for the world to accept it, to say, look, I know you're trying to get to Hamas, who is trying to blend in with the population, but no civilians are coming out into the Sinai, which is, if I know you guys do, but the layperson has no idea what's the difference between Egypt and Sinai Desert. And when Egypt said not one civilian, not one displaced person camp, not even people trafficking through Egypt to get out of harm's way, is very unique in war and put a restraint on Israel that was going to make the goal very hard to achieve. So I'm actually surprised at the success Israel has had with that one constraint of not being able to get the civilians out of harm's way, unlike we saw in Lebanon, where there was a very low civilian death rate against when attacking Hezbollah because the civilians were able to move out of harm's way. There are a lot of both self-restraints, like the occupying part, the civilians out of harm's way, the international community's ideals about humanitarian aid and having to feed the population while you're fighting the battles. There's so many nuances, but I do believe you're right. Some things are old with a new spin. Had there been, social media during World War II, I think it would have went a lot differently. Just based on what the populations of all these different countries believed was happening and whether the goal and the cost, right? Because you have to convince a population that the cost is worth it, like in Israel. And I've asked this question because my concern was that the Israeli people would, not that there's any similarities to Vietnam, but we won every battle in Vietnam, but we lost a war. By every definition, lost a war when the American society said the cost is not worth what you say is going to be achieved or how it's going to be achieved or even the reasons that we're doing it. I've been concerned that the Israeli population will say, look, the cost is too much because in a democracy, that really matters, as we've seen in wars. It's always a contest of will between two militaries, two political apparatuses, and the people. So I've been concerned that the people will say, look, I don't want to occupy Gaza. And I'm sure that was a part of the calculation. The Israeli people don't want to occupy Gaza. There's scar tissue from southern Lebanon. There's scar tissue from lots of situations. But at this point, the population may say, look, I understand the necessity of the goal, but we no longer think that the price to be paid is worth it. And then you get to these other than victories that you've seen in wars where people say, look, technically it is a victory from an analytical perspective, but war is human and that's not necessarily, it's never black and white like that.
Great. John, if you don't mind, can I ask one last question before I let you go? Are you good on time?
Of course, no,
I'm
I'm
keeping
good.
an eye on the clock here. I know we've taken a lot of your time, but I do have, we can continue this conversation forever, but been happy to do so. But I want to be cognizant of your time and kindness here. So, it's going back to your earlier point about the structure, and again, it's getting into a little bit to the weeds of the configuration of the Israeli army. I mean, there's been a kind of a shift now. I mean, we've seen a shift between the Herzia Levi, Aviv Kochavis of the world, who are infantrymen going into the Yal Zamirs of the world, going from infantry into tankers, AFPCs, and everything else that's going on. There were a lot of assessments as far as the amount of equipment and the amount of support that was there on 10/7. Do you believe that this shift now that's taking place, between, the Herzia levies, the infantry going into a different kind of philosophy is the direction Israel should go in, and is that part of the holes or problems that Israel had because, in let's look in the kind of the operational theory that they had before, the reliance on intelligence and the tech and whatnot. There were
And special
the
forces.
special forces. There were failures in all of that, and that came back clearly to bite us. Is this something that Israel can regain and recuperate from as far as going forward, as far as kind of trying to shift the operational kind of structure of how they do business?
It's a great question. It really, is reminiscent of a lot of research I do around the world. Most people don't understand how much militaries are cultures. They think a certain way, from their founding to their evolutions, right? So the evolution and these also something that General Master wrote about that I've written about that is rampant in Western world, as much as other militaries, are these fallacies of what is necessary to win in war, right? You have the vampire, what we call the zero dark 30 fallacy about special forces can achieve strategic goals, right? So the deep raid into Syria that was amazing that the Shell Dog and others did to attack a site. But there's a belief that that can win wars, or the idea of the what we call the vampire fallacy, which is the technology thing that you just can't kill it, where people just think I just got to have better tech, this game-changing tech, and that will achieve my strategic goal, and then I can make my military smaller. I can have less of a standing military. I don't have to have as many people serving. I mean, look at the British military right now is the smallest it's ever been in the British history. It's crazy these military cultural thinking methodologies or dogmas that amount. And yes, Israel was had succumbed to that, right? So the reliance on technology, and of course the awesomeness of the Israeli Air Force, all of that. But when you start to believe that you don't need land power, you don't need infantry, right? So yeah, like you said, there's a culture even within the IDF of the armor community, and you have the Air Force community, then you have the Special Forces community, and it all gets down to which is the investments again, going back to October 7th. You saw years of, well, we don't need as much mandatory service for as long as we do. We don't need as big of a standing military. All of these assumptions that go into it that get called to action in war. And that's a overriding across the world ideal that you can invest in technologies and need less people, or that you'll have bloodless wars where there won't be you won't have losses. All of these absolutely you would think that October 7th should have changed everything, right? Not just in Israel as a nation, as in like what does border defense mean within the communities, to investments in the military, which I know the commission recently is going to invest more in military. And yes, Israel's advantage is its innovations and its technology, but you'll hope that it changes even a military thinking of what is necessary to have and to include in size of your infantry formations. And it, I don't know. And I think the jury's still out on whether this has changed so much. Because when you have a success like the 12-day war, intelligence, long range strategic bombing, advanced technologies, it negates kind of the argument of, well, I still need large amounts of land power, infantry, armor, engineer assets to be able to defend the nation when time comes to rapidly overwhelm the enemy. You would hope that this changes things, but I think time will have to tell. It, it's the biggest mistake of militaries around the world is to de-invest and believe in the UK is the greatest example I could ever give on trying to cut training time, cut the size of formations, cut the spending in especially modern day threats that are the enemy is always planning and right, and Hamas thought very creatively on how to attack Israel's weaknesses to include its size of its border security, reliance on technology, belief in what it could do in bombing, all of these things. And that you would hope that there are some massive changes in the Israel military thinking in that vein.
Great, thank you. John, I can't thank you enough. I mean, really, we've taken a lot of your time. You've been very generous. And I want to thank you. I want to thank Alex for joining me this afternoon. Hopefully, you could come back and join us again. It's at a later point. Again, big fans of your work, and whatever we can do to amplify it. Obviously, our membership knows we deal a lot with these issues. Are mostly in the academy, so we are people are hearing a lot of misinformation and the lack of imagination. To your point about what's happening on the ground. So your voice is critical, and so thank you for all you do, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Alex, thank you as always, and as always, we will talk soon, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.